Remember Swift in the Defense 5? You probably don't, but the pilot released right here to YouTube 3 years ago. It was almost 22 minutes in length, animated by one person, and featured Disney voice talent Vincent Martella and David Ergo Jr. And it flopped. But why? Let's talk about that, shall we? A little background around SwiftSpark. I was 14 when I started writing its story in 2016, and I just turned 22 when I released the first half of the pilot in the summer of 2023. I was very young and inexperienced, and honestly I still am. So I wanted to start off by emphasizing that I don't view this pilot as a personal failure, more like a learning experience. First projects hardly ever take off, and sometimes it's even a creator's last Hail Mary after several quote-unquote duds that finally gets them noticed. I just wanted to have a brief, nuanced little chat about my experience as a young, budding creator, because my life has changed a lot, as in completely, since releasing this pilot, and if I had to make it today, in my current situation, things would have gone very differently. So, to start off on a positive note, I want to give myself my flowers for this project regardless. From the heart, this pilot was me wanting to prove something to myself. I've been working on the comic for about 3.5 years by the time I discovered indie animation. I stumbled across Long Gone Gulch, the Kickstarter, and from there I also found the Has-Been pilot, and it just clicked. I had written the comic story for SwiftSpark with a 2-year time skip in the middle. So basically the main storyline I was working on at that time was the beginning and the ending of the story. And the time skip in between I originally envisioned would be later filled in with shorter comics, sort of villain of the week style. And at the time I was also super into the Amazing Spider-Man cartoon, and Miraculous, so I figured why not take the leap and why not try to make your own pilot instead of doing it with comics. I even got to pitch the show to Frederator in 2020, and again in 2023. Neither ended up going anywhere, but that's just a little, that little milestone I like to remind myself on. Regardless of how it went, you did that. You went out there, you put yourself out there, and you did that, and that's still worth acknowledging and being proud of, honestly. The proof of concept I showed at that pitch originally looked like this, and yeah, it's not great, and it was rushed, so that adds to the not looking greatness. But it was the first step towards what would become the pilot's opening scene further down the line, and that ended up looking like this. And that's just 2 years of improvement. So I improved pretty fast, if you ask me. And by the time I started working on this version, the comic version was drawing to a close, and I tried to run a Kickstarter, but obviously failed, and that triggered me to give myself a challenge. I had the budget for voice acting, sound design, and a soundtrack. Those were my savings at the time. Very responsible. And I just wonder, what if I gave it a shot? The reason I set up that crowdfunding campaign was because I didn't believe I could make a pilot on my own. But after it went bust, I just figured, why not try first before you immediately tell yourself I can't do it? So, yeah, I ended up proving to myself that I could make a pilot. And I could still do it today, but not in the way that I did back then in 2022, 2023. I won't deny that it's at least somewhat impressive still. 22 minutes within a year all by myself. It's impressive numbers no matter how you cut it. But there's massive caveats here, and I would not be able to recreate this pilot within a year if I had to do it now. But I'll circle back around to that later. This pilot sort of flopped, right? Well, it didn't sort of flop. It flopped. I've had animations cross 1 million views, and they're no longer publicly available, but they're still in my private videos, and I can still see those numbers, so even imagine an older short film I made in high school currently sits at over 3 times the views of the first half of the pilot, and even more than that than the second half. So why do I personally think that this happened? Well, first of all, the marketing all came down to me, and it's safe to say that I am awful at marketing. I slapped together a couple of trailers, but they're frankly not that great, and I didn't do a great job sharing them around either, because at some point you tweet out the trailer for the 14th time that day, you start feeling pushy. And that being said, superhero stories are a bit hard to market, I guess, because we've sort of seen them all before, I feel like. Most people will hear your log line and go, oh, that just sounds like X, and pass on it. It's not a fault of the product, it's just that there's so much out there already. And it's also a genre that interests quite a niche audience, because the big names tend to draw in a big crowd, because there's a multitude of factors such as nostalgia, effective marketing, and families going because the kids want to see it, or the parents want to share their childhood with the kids, stuff like that. But getting a new superhero off the ground isn't that easy, but I suppose you still could say that about any new IP these days. So while lack of audience interest may have been a part of it, it's definitely not the main cause, and at the end of the day, superhero fatigue is just a convenient excuse, so I don't lean too hard into that. It's definitely more so that I didn't do a good job of marketing it and getting people interested, that foot over the threshold, so to say, in the first place. And the animation style, well, the animation skill-wise isn't perfect, but as I mentioned before, I had videos with way worse animation, hit way bigger view counts, so I don't really think that that's quite as big of a drawback as some people would argue it is either. So the biggest reason I think my pilot flopped is that it's boring. It's boring. I gambled with the story, and I lost. While chronologically, this is where the series would have started. It wasn't an interesting premise for a pilot. Sure, the main characters all get introduced, but aside from that, just nothing happens. It's a superhero show, and the main character does exactly 0 superhero stuff for the entire runtime. And that's what killed it. It might have survived the other flaws it has, such as some stilted dialogue and long awkward pauses between characters speaking, especially at the beginning, but what it comes down to is that this pilot just didn't have an interesting enough premise to capture people's attention. And that is exactly what a pilot is supposed to do. There's times where the pilot episode gets reworked to become the first official episode once the show is released, like Tourist Trap for Gravity Falls, or Once Upon a Time's pilot, which I believe is just straight up the pilot is the first episode. But not always. Sometimes it's just a test episode that feels like it could take place at any time in a would-be season. And in retrospect, the second episode I had planned would have made for a much better representation of what the show would have been like. It's even titled Introducing the Defense 5. I've talked about why I can't finish this episode right now before, and I'll dive a little further into that later, but right now I just want to talk about what that episode would have been like, and then we'll get to the why now, or why not now parts as we get to them. And I do have to add, this was all written after the pilot was completely finished and released. Like, I didn't start working on this until way after, so it's really just hindsight is 2020 me realizing that I fucked up with the pilot, and if I'd written this 3 years ago, it would have been way more interesting than what I ended up putting out. So, the episode starts off with James jumping and running across rooftops, just casually using his powers, because I imagine any kid with superpowers would just go out and do that when they had a bunch of free time. And James doesn't quite have a grasp on his powers yet, so they fail, and as he falls, he's saved by a magical purple portal and flops back onto a nearby rooftop, where his sister Samira and her best friend Bella are waiting. Especially in the early episodes, I kind of want James to have this bit of an air of irresponsibility and eagerness about him, about how he treats his powers. And so his friends are just kind of there to wrangle him in a way, to prevent him from, getting himself into more trouble than he can reasonably handle. And that's exactly what this rooftop exchange is about, because obviously Samira and Bella have been following him, kind of expecting him to fuck up eventually, until Thomas appears and alerts them to trouble going on at the zoo. And yeah, while writing this episode, the whole time I was just going, we're going to the zoo, and then we're gonna see some animals in my head, because we have zero original thoughts up in here ever, and it's a catchy song, it's a catchy song, and Milo Murphy's Law deserve better. And at the zoo, the Defense 5 kind of encounters their villain of the week. His name is Joffrey, and he's a zookeeper that Viper managed to convince that he's the leader of the new world run by animals. And in this episode, he's really not much of a threat because he can't actually communicate with the animals. Yet. Yeah, I had plans to involve this guy in a future episode, but that's for a later episode of the podcast. In this episode, he's just a tool to test Viper's ability enhancers. And obviously, that also means that Marin's there, watching and observing from a distance. James comes up with a plan to deal with Joffrey because he's just kind of jumping and running around with the ability enhancers, making him kind of difficult to catch. And it should be a slam dunk. Except, of course, for the moment where, wait for it, James's powers fail. Bella has to bail him out with a portal again, and this leads to Joffrey escaping. Luckily, Bella's quick to deal with the problem, and he's trapped within, 2 seconds once again. But it's still a kind of a ding to James's ego. Maybe it would have been smarter to use a portal from the get-go. Hindsight's 20/20, right? Anyway, James is embarrassed, and he tries not to let it get to him, and he heads out to town to help out the people of Spring Hill. So, tiny, tiny stuff that I would expect a realistic, superhero child to actually do. He rescues a cat from a tree, retrieves a bag from a purse snatcher, and when he encounters some bigger bad guys, they still end up hanging him out to dry. And Marin is watching everything go down from a distance, as she does. And this is easily my favorite part of the episode, because it's a song number, and that's why I went straight ahead to finish it, and it came out before anything else. It's an amazing song montage with music written and produced by B Slick, and it's on the channel if you're interested in watching the whole thing. I love the song, and it really encapsulates what James's character is all about. And I love this song. It's also on Spotify. Just go watch it. Go listen to it. We are moving on with the next bit of the episode, where Marin sees how hard James is trying to get the people's attention, and she decides to use this eagerness to her advantage. Once again, as she does. And as the sun begins to set later that evening, James is approached by a mystery journalist. She invites James to an interview and disappears. James is, of course, very eager and doesn't see the danger, and calls his friends, who are obviously less thrilled because they do see the danger, and oh my god, how do you keep falling for this bullshit? His friends head straight to Lightning, specifically to Ursula and Angelo, and they're unfortunately of little help because they just tell the team to go along with it and to keep James out of harm's way. It's not the most responsible adult thing to do, since everyone in this room can smell it's a trap from a mile away, including the audience, but these two have their reasons to keep James busy. A bored James could start snooping, and they don't want any snooping. So the next day, the entire Defense 5 heads out to the studio for James's interview, and turns out it's a trap. Gosh darn it, who would have possibly thunk that this would be a trap? The mystery journalist then reveals herself to be Shogai, an agent working for Viper, and she tells the Defense 5 that they have mere minutes to escape her diabolical obstacle course. But, in a way, James is getting what he was promised, because Shogai reveals that the whole thing is being live-streamed. It was designed around just James having to work his way up, but with how much time they spend arguing, Marin believes that the entire team being there actually works to the obstacle course's benefit, because they'll just spend all the time they have until the Viper agents arrive bickering. James is surprisingly quick, again, to come up with a plan. He's good at that kind of thing, you know, just shaking plans out of his sleeve. And he apologizes to his friends for acting like a brat earlier. And he admits that he's not a full-fledged hero yet, and that he does need his friends by his side. That together they're stronger than him on his own. He trusts them and knows that they'll always be there for him when he needs them. And I feel like this is where the episode kinda starts falling apart for a bit, so we'll look back around with my thoughts on that in a minute, but first the Defense 5 agrees, albeit a bit hesitant, to help James beat the obstacle course, even if they don't have to. They agree with James that it can help boost her reputation with the townspeople. They use their powers and they help each other to get past each obstacle, eventually reaching the top, where Shogai is waiting with 2 Viper agents at her side. And James asks his friends to trust him for one last plan. He tricks the agents down into the glass box that they were trapped in earlier. Well, James and his friends, not the Viper agents. And Thomas once again uses hypnosis to trick Shogai into reactivating the traps, mirroring the plan from earlier that morning, except this time, it goes off without a hitch. What do you know? The Defense 5 returns home, and James immediately goes on the hunt to find Shogai's stream of their performance. Finding thousands of people watched it, he expresses hope to Samira that maybe their dad watched it too, and that closes out the episode. And I swear, I didn't do it intentionally, but a while back I just started looking at this episode again and realized how many parallels there are between this episode and the pilot. Except this time there's actual superhero stuff going on surrounding those parallels. James still gets tricked by a Viper agent, still gets caught in their trap, still has his friends bailing him out, except this time he's in his superhero suit for the majority of the runtime. Actually, all of the runtime. And he uses his powers, and there's an actual bad guy to fight, you know? I just feel like it's a more exciting plot than the plot that the pilot had going on, and that's why in retrospect I just feel like it would have worked better as the pilot. It still shows off the majority of the main cast and how their dynamics play off of each other, and it still works as an introductory episode. But it's just more fun to watch, honestly. And I'll admit that it's not a perfect episode, especially when I started boarding it. I realized I wrote myself into a corner for a bit, because see this shot here? Yeah, James, what's happening here, if it's not clear to everyone in the audience, James can go invisible. And right here, he goes invisible, and he escapes the handcuffs that have been put on his hands, and he runs away. And James isn't supposed to be able to do that. When he uses his invisibility powers, especially early on, everything he touches turns invisible, until he learns to control his powers more specifically. So, essentially what's happening here is the Viper agent and the handcuffs should have turned invisible too. So maybe I could work my way around this with a rewrite, only the things James touches turn invisible and not stuff that's touching him. But it's just, it's a cool little sequence, but right now it's a plot hole, and I still went ahead boarding it anyway, thinking I would get back to it and rewrite it as I said, maybe like only if he's touching it with his hands does it also turn invisible, But it's set untouched for now because I just can't come up with a way that makes enough sense. But maybe like the angry cartoon review critics are just breathing down my neck a little bit too much with this. But it's not just that one scene, like one sequence. That's a stupid plot hole. You probably saw that for the obstacle course section, the storyboards became very different. And that's because those are not storyboards, but the sketches I made for the comic. I haven't actually gone to boarding that section. So, yeah, I struggled with designing the obstacle course a lot. Initially, I intended to add another song montage to that portion of the episode, so I boarded around it until I got to make this song. The song was going to be about teamwork. Like working together and like powering through every obstacle was the title I'd come up with. So like the theme of the song was if we work together we can power through, something like that. But yeah, I had no clue to tackle that obstacle course, how to design it, how to effectively go about it, because backgrounds and environment design, quite frankly, aren't my strong suit. If you couldn't already tell by how boring and empty the backgrounds were in the pilot. And this section would entirely depend, like this section would just completely fall or stand with the environment. And that's why I intended on hiring folks to help me with these episodes. Visual development, storyboards, just like I did with the pilot, I wanted others to help me fill the gaps that my own skill set was missing to make an even more ambitious episode. And that's why I wouldn't be too confident to finish this episode on my own to begin with. The crucial big finale scene of the third act would be lacking that oomph it would need. And I just feel like it would fall flat again, just like the pilot did. And that lack of confidence does lead back to why I went with such a boring pilot. It was well within the confines of my frankly limited skill set. And although I'd already spent 18 months improving my animation skills from this to this, and my storyboard skills, not to mention from this to this, it's not like I didn't learn anything from this pilot, but I still played it safe with simple animation, just sitting, standing, and talking. But that also means a simple storyline, and that crippled this pilot. It crippled a pilot that was supposed to be about a teen superhero, and it ended up feeling much more like a slice of life than the full series would have been. I wonder that if the intro hadn't been there, if people would have even realized that it was about a teenage superhero. And of course, there's the insane timeline of this pilot's production. I spent 2 years writing it, then 2 months boarding it, and then animated it at Mach speed in just 11 months. That's almost 2 minutes per month. I was still living at home, which was a massive luxury position that allowed me to work on this pretty much non-stop. Shortly after finishing the pilot, it was made known that I could no longer be able to live at home, so that's the first thing that changed. And of course, with moving out comes expensive, meaning less to put towards Spark. And I just started making a decent income months before getting kicked out, and I'm afraid that my income peaked in late 2023. Since then, my income's taken more than a couple of hits, and it doesn't seem to be over yet, so I've had to start keeping a bit more of a close eye on what I spent money on. I keep my savings for emergencies now and no longer to just spend on whatever the fuck I feel like a responsible adult. Because basically, when you have to finally become that responsible adult in the real world, you don't have as much money as you had living at home, and life just likes getting in my way on top of that, but that's just life for you. I'm not special in that regard. In retrospect, talking about all of this stuff just makes so much sense, and I don't think anyone was expecting me to be able to keep up the speed at which I finished the pilot for every episode. It was me. I wanted that. And I got embarrassed and all up in my own feelings because I couldn't. In my hiatus video, I did discuss another aspect of it. I haven't been living in the best situation as of late, and trying to find a new place has been really difficult and kind of the focus of my life the past year. The situation has improved a little bit now, because when I made that video, I hadn't slept for more than 4 hours a night in 6 months. And I'll tell you, a lack of sleep makes you go really nutty and say really things you wouldn't usually say if you had your head on straight. Let's put it that way. So, while soloing a pilot in a year is already unrealistic for most, if not just straight up unachievable, thinking you can keep up a whole series like that definitely is. I was planning to solo board 5 episodes in a year and a half, build a Patreon audience off of those somehow, and then finish the 5 episodes with a team, and the alternative was to continue soloing an episode every other year instead of every year. Yeah, I gave myself twice as much time. Oh my god. Crazy, I know. But I was fully convinced that I could. At the moment, the indefinite hiatus stands for the animated series, like solid on the ground, not moving. I need to get my personal life sorted out first, find a new place to live, settle into that new place, new life, and after that, I can look into bringing Swiss Park back. I'm still working on it in the background. I've got a new project going on, which I hope to trickle down more information about in the near future. Occasionally, you'll catch me talking about it on Blue Sky or on here, because I intend to make this a series. Call it a podcast, if you will. There's so many ideas for Swiss Park that I'll likely never get to put into action, but I still want to share them. And I could just talk about various episode ideas, and not to mention the lore, for countless hours and hours and hours, just yap sessions, if you will. So I guess this could be considered the first episode of that podcast. I'm also gonna be making fun of myself in some occasions, especially the next episode, because I kind of died inside making that one. Why would you do that? No. But it's all in good fun. I promise it's all in good fun. And who knows, maybe in the future you'll be seeing stuff from this podcast actually appear on screen for real episodes. Oh my god. Yeah, I don't know. A guy can dream, after all. And at the end of the day, the core issue surrounding it all was me needing to allow myself to rest and breathe and realize that, nobody gives a shit. At the end of the day, as I said, it really was just me trying to push myself, not realizing that I can't keep pushing forever. And while I can still acknowledge that I made some mistakes and cut some corners that I shouldn't have, and that ended up costing me, I still went out there and made something, and that's worth acknowledging 100%. And as I mentioned at the start, first projects are hardly ever a slam dunk, and maybe if we do ever get to make that second episode, it might just blow up. Who knows? For now, I'm just gonna be doing what makes me happy, and I can already tell that yapping about this show makes me happy. And of course, there's that new secret background project that I'm working on. That's also making me happy, and I'm just full on hobby mode again with Spark, and we'll see where it goes in the future. Thank you for listening all the way through during whatever you were doing. Maybe you were watching for the storyboards and concept art, and if you didn't, maybe you should go back and look at it. Either way, I appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you in the next one.